I won't feel forced. I won't feel violated. I won't feel scared every time I enter the newsroom. I won't feel like, oh my God, why do I have to sit next to this person? Oh my God, why do I have to go to an event or a press conference with this person? Why do I have to stay until the 9 p.m., 10 p.m. bulletin with this person? Why do I have to go to his office? Because in most instances, it's the boss.
Welcome to another episode of Her Media Diary, a podcast that captures the lived experiences of African women working in media industries. I am Dr. Yemisi Akinbobola, your host, and in this episode, I'm joined by Rachel Ombaka, a seasoned editor, media trainer, activist, and public speaker. You may have caught her work on Citizen TV, The Daily Nation, and more. Today, Rachel and I discuss the issue of sexual harassment in Kenyan newsrooms and her activism around this area. Now, to give some context, in 2020, African Women in Media and Foyo Media Institute conducted research that looked at the barriers faced by African women working in media. One of the most prominent barriers was sexual harassment. Throughout this series, we will be in conversation with African women in media industries to discuss the various issues that emerged from the research. By inviting these voices into conversation, we hope to provide solutions to breaking down barriers for African women in media industries. Before we start, though, a quick disclaimer to our listeners. Sexual and gender based violence are sensitive topics, and you might find aspects of this episode distressing and triggering. In the show notes, we have included links to helplines, support groups, and organizations that specialize in supporting survivors of sexual harassment and gender based violence. So, Rachel Mbaka, it's great to speak with you today. You and I first met in Nairobi in 2019 during the African Women in the Media conference, and which was our third conference. A lot has happened since then. But, we'd never really got time to chat and to really sit down and get to know your amazing work and stuff. So, I'm really looking forward to today's conversation so that we can really get into your work, your amazing work around sexual harassment, gender based violence, etc. Before we get into that, how are you?
I'm doing really, really, really well on a personal, that is mental health wise, physical wise, and work wise. The last time we met, I think I was still at Citizen TV Kenya. Yeah, one of the mainstream media outlets. So I left that employer and I currently work for a French media firm. Um, and I honestly think it is because of the work that I've been doing, which is the reason why, yeah, it's my life work wise seems to have moved from not only a local level, but now, regional and international. Um, I used to do a lot of writing, but right now I am mostly in the managerial level, so to speak, not only as a board member on the Association of Media Women in Kenya, but even in conversations such as these, most of the conversations that we have are in terms of interventions, because a lot of the time, I realized at the beginning it was a lot of lamentations, and I feel like I've spoken a lot about this, particularly with local media. There's a lot of lamentations, and we tend to forget, when you focus so much on the problem, you get lost in the problem, and yet you're supposed to be moving beyond that. See, what is your role in, resolving the problem? What is your role in amplifying? So lamenting, yes, has its place, but conversations have to move beyond just lamenting.
And find solutions. Exactly. So we're gonna everything you just said, we're gonna unpack all of that and really get into the nitty gritty. So before we get into your work in the media, how you got started and all, let's take us all the way back to the early years of Rachel. Where did it all start?
So I am a child in a family of five. So mom and dad, and then three children. So me, my brother who's currently in the UK, he's doing something that I struggle pronouncing, anesthesiology. I, I got it right.
Woo!
And my sister, the last born, is in Seattle. So Rachel is the only one who remained local.
Wow. Good on you.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, so my brother is in medical field and my sister is in the, what can I say, the advocacy field. She works with an organization that fights for the rights of people irrespective of their identity. And I draw a lot of inspiration from that. I feel like my family really defines who I am today. And one personal thing I'd like to mention is that my mom recently relocated to Seattle around 2 years ago and moved there because she had been a victim of gender based violence for about 30 years. And we had no idea until she relocated. Um, yeah, and all my life growing up, I've always wondered why the issue of sexual harassment, GBV, always gets to me. And much as we'd love to delve into what was your childhood like, I don't have memories of it. And I feel that that is because my brain, you know how the brain processes trauma? I
Yeah.
feel like probably my brain put that in a box and locked it away. So I'm currently in therapy trying to unpack a lot of these things.
It's interesting that you said that you have no memory of your childhood, and that's something I've never encountered before. So, what does that mean for you? Like, how does that impact you?
For the longest time, I've felt like I didn't belong, like I was lost. Um, and I didn't know why until I started therapy. And I also felt like every time, like we would meet or talk with siblings over the phone, and then they'll be like, "Oh, you remember when this happened?" And I'm like, "No, I don't." And then they'd make fun of me because they also didn't realize why it is that Rachel doesn't remember. So I always felt out of place. Um, and I felt like there was something wrong with me. And yet, right now, I realize, the type of women I surround myself with, the type of men I surround with, are always telling me it's okay not to be okay. It's okay to feel whatever you feel. There's no right and wrong. So I guess I am now comfortable in finding myself, but before I was unsettled. And now that I'm a mom, I saw myself passing that feeling of being unsettled to my kids. And it's one of the reasons I sought therapy. So it's still a journey.
We're often trying to cover up, right? So much of ourselves. We're often trying to bring out this front that everything is okay. But it's so interesting what you said there, that the people that you surround yourself with say it's okay not to be okay. And how do you find that in terms of this processing of this locked up trauma, as you put it?
You took the words right off my mouth because the way that my other family members processed the trauma of my mother when they realized it, it's very different from the way I am processing it. So, you know me, I'm very vocal, whether physically or on social media. But my family is very private, not just the nuclear family, but the extended family as well, uncles, aunties, all that. So, in the beginning, when they started seeing me being vocal about sexual violence in general, there was a lot of pushback. And that is why I am intentional about the statement that I used when I said the men and women I surround myself with now constantly remind me that Rachel, it is okay. It is okay. Whatever you're feeling is okay. Before, because that wasn't how it was before. It was not at all. Um, so to answer also your question on my work in advocacy at the moment, the more I speak up, the more I look for interventions. Basically, in everything that I do, I feel like I heal in every process, in every conversation like this one today, which is why I said yes to have this conversation with you. Um, it feels like part of the healing journey for me because I feel better after every encounter, after every public speaking engagement. Um, Even though the system often fights back. Um, for example, when you try to approach an organization and say, I want to train you on this and that, they'll be like, we don't need it. Or they'll be like, who the hell do you think you are trying to change things around here? But in that fight, I feel I become stronger, whether or not it ends up being a positive experience or not, and which is why I continue doing and being who I am.
Mm. And you mentioned there that when you became a mother, that also changed how you saw things. Tell us more about that.
That's a painful topic, motherhood, because for the longest time I felt like I was a horrible mother. And I didn't understand why, because I hadn't started working on myself. I didn't know that I was carrying trauma and I was passing on the trauma to my child. So I used to be a very harsh mother, very, very harsh. Um, and it's quite unfortunate that in the African setting, for the longest time, harsh motherhood was celebrated. People would say, this is what, makes great women. And yet it isn't, because women, African women in particular, have been through trauma. They still go through trauma even in 2022, but they have not known the language to vocalize it. They have not known that if they don't deal with it, they'll pass it on to their children. Like my daughter would do something, break a glass, but the way I would reprimand her, you'd think she's killed someone. That was not right. For the longest time, she used to be afraid to hug me. Nowadays, she comes from school and she hugs me. It's a very simple thing, but it speaks so much to how I've changed as a person in terms of being approachable, not just in my home, but outside as well. I was also unapproachable outside. My very first job was at the Nation Media Group. And for the longest time, I used to be described as an unapproachable person. Um,
Which as a journalist is not necessarily.
Exactly, exactly. And not just in terms of the sources you speak to, but even in terms of sisterhood in the media. How are you supposed to develop sisterhood with someone who is unapproachable? Doesn't make sense. But it is still understandable because this person, Rachel, had built walls because of what had happened to her, and she didn't realize that she had built walls. You know what I mean? I've also realized on social media, most of the negative, bullish responses are from people projecting their trauma, and which is why I speak out to say you have to deal with yourself before you engage with other people. In the same way, I'm saying I was passing on my trauma to my child without realizing it. Because it's like the flu. If you don't do something about it, you just keep on spreading it. If you don't, like during the COVID time, you had to, isolate and things like that. So if you don't um, introspect, if you don't call yourself to a meeting, if you don't think about how your words impact people, how your actions take people back to the trauma that they're trying to deal with to come out of, then you're doing yourself and the people around you a disservice, right? So it all starts with you, the individual.
And you are definitely somebody that has been doing a lot around this, right? In your work in journalism, you're now the vice president of the Association of Women, Media Women in Kenya, Amwick, and I love Amwick. Amwick and I were my great friends. So talk us through that journey of, like, you talked earlier on about your first job was at Nation. What was that moment of self-realization, and how did all of that, the history, the work, the realization, then take you on this journey?
My 8 years at Nation were a shadow of what my life right now is. I was a good girl coming to work at the right time, do the right thing, you know, don't get in trouble. And I thought that this is what makes a good, a good employee. This is how I'm going to get noticed. This is how I'm going to get elevated. Um, but I was frustrated most of the time because I used to work the midnight shift, number one. So my life revolved around the newsroom. I had no social life because by the time you're getting home after that shift, you're tired. You're like a nurse, you're like a doctor who's getting home and you need to recharge for the next day. Um, so my life was work, you know, work, home, work, home. Um, so I feel my life there was very shallow. My thinking there was very shallow. although the tools that I learned, the tools of the trade that I learned there, are the reasons why I was able to get the jobs after that. Um, so my experience there did count for something professionally. But when I moved from there, and it was a struggle to move from there, um, because when you're in a comfort zone and you're scared of taking the leap, it is not a good place to be. And that is why I ended up staying there for those 8 years, because even my parents would be like, why are you thinking of leaving? Nation is the best employer in the country. And they were at that time that I joined. And people out there would hear, oh, you work at Nation. Oh, wow, amazing. So the subtle things that make you think, okay, maybe I shouldn't leave. But I always used to have this nagging feeling, like Stacey Oracle's song. I don't know whether you know her. There's gotta be more to life. That song was always in my head, and I never used to understand why. So I became a mom when I was at Nation Media Group, and it is what jolted me. It is what made me leave my job, because the amount of money I was making there wasn't enough to provide not just for me but for my child. Um, so I decided enough is enough. Um, I don't know what the future hold, what greener pastures are out there, but I'm going to take the leap anyway. So I left without a plan B and I was, I needed something else and I didn't know what else I could do except leave. Um, so I left, and for about 2, 3 years, I was jobless. And I remember I used to bake cakes. I used to sell cakes for birthdays and things like that. So my page is also still on Instagram. But as fate would have it, um, I left Nation thinking the media industry is a place that I shouldn't be. But as fate would have it, I went back to the media industry. I landed at Citizen TV. And I landed at Citizen TV when I was pregnant with my second child. And that was amazing for me because women in Africa who are part of the workforce, you have very few stories. You hear a woman saying, I was employed when I was pregnant, because pregnancy is seen as, you know, she's going to leave in the next 3 months. That in itself spoke a lot to me. I was like, okay, this looks like it's going to be a good experience. Then while I was there, I had a boss who was exact opposite of my previous boss. So the previous boss was very focused on, do a good job, just focus on your work. But my new boss, I don't understand what he saw, but he'd always push me to these events. Go and speak here, go and do this here. Like it felt like he was propelling me up to leadership without me realizing what he was seeing or what he was doing. And then it was during that same period that one of my work colleagues, Asha Mwilu, told me about AWIM. She was like, Rachel, you've been speaking a lot about sexual harassment. Um, I think you'd be great at speaking at this conference that AWIM is having in Nairobi. And she did that because in the newsroom, I suddenly became very vocal about my experience. When I joined Citizen TV, I had a sexual harassment experience. Um, I got a filthy text from a man who would be probably the same age as my father. And I felt disgusted. I felt like a commodity. I felt like, what did I do to deserve this? And that's another thing which still angers me today. Why do women go through that? And in case this ever happens to my daughter, because we have no control over the experiences that our children have, will she also blame herself? That shouldn't be the case. So because of that anger, um, I found my voice. I told out the perpetrator. I sought help from the HR. Um, I discovered there was an association called Amwick that I hadn't interacted with before. I started seeking help from within and without, and being vocal about why I was seeking help. And I feel like my journey is interconnected in that, because I felt bold enough to leave Nation, not because of a bad experience, but because I wanted to do more and be more. By the time I was joining Citizen, that, um, you know, that urge to do something about something that is wrong was already there. It was already in my blood.
I want to take a few steps back because the first thing that you said about getting comfortable, right? Getting comfortable and having that kind of bravery, that courage to actually say, okay, I need to take another step now, right? Let's dig more into that. How did you get through that?
It didn't come naturally to me because, as I said before, I was someone who, you know, how they tell girls behave well, dress well, uh, don't go out alone. That was me within my first job. In my second, I was a bad girl because society likes to put labels. I became a bad girl um, because I went through I went through a certain training called Women in News, and it was a training. When I took up that training, again, my boss at Citizen is the one who was like, "Why don't you try this?" When I took up that training, I took it up thinking it would propel me to leadership. What I didn't realize is that one of the courses within that media management training was sexual harassment. So we were taught, we were in South Africa for the program, and we were several women from different parts of Africa. So we were taught the basics. What is sexual harassment? Because, as I said earlier, our mothers didn't have the vocabulary to describe what they were going through. When I was taught about sexual harassment, it felt like, you know, like a light bulb. This happened to me. Oh, that's what that's called. I didn't know. And then aside from that, hearing other women also say, that's happened to me. Oh, I thought it was just me. So it was a compilation of experiences during that program that made me, uh, probably I shouldn't say bad girl, although I don't really care what labels people decide, but it is how to answer your question, it is how I found my bravery. Being taught how to identify what to do when you face, you know, sexual harassment, where to go, right? And then trust, not just where to go, because a lot of the times you're told, okay, go to the police and report. That's very different. That's very different from being told, I am here for you. I am a phone call away, no matter the time of day. That's a very different offer of help.
And you made a very important point there about trust, right? Because you got to trust the system is going to work to support you in that process. So it's not just about the person you're going to speak to, but is one is the person, but then also is the process, is the environment, is the structures available going to be able to take you through that process in a way that is not kind of re-traumatizing, re-victimizing, those kind of things. I was in Rwanda earlier this year where we met with different stakeholders in the media um, around sexual harassment, because one of the research that we did in the last couple of years was around the experiences of women in Rwanda, and sexual harassment was number one thing, right? And just like you said, it's number one. There's the issue of recognition that something is sexual harassment, the interpretation, but then also that there's recourse for help, because you find that a lot of women end up having to just, like you said, self blame or just get on with it. It's kind of like the mantra, isn't it, right?
Exactly.
So it's really important. I think I buy into what you said about the fact that the knowledge is really important, the training is really important, and that knowledge is really powerful in getting you through much of these experiences.
Yes. And I must add, please, but in the media, women are told, grow a thick skin. This is what happens. You should get used to it. And yet, no, 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 no. It's not right. It has no place. It has no place in your home. It has no place in your workplace. So when I started fighting back after my training, words like cock blocker emerged. Um, Guys were like, "How do you expect us to get wives?" I'm like, "There's a huge difference. There's a huge difference between sexual harassment and courting for romance purposes, for girlfriend or marriage purposes. There's a huge difference. I won't feel forced. I won't feel violated. I won't feel scared every time I enter the newsroom. You know, I won't feel like, oh my God, why do I have to sit next to this person? Oh my God, why do I have to go to an event or a press conference with this person? Why do I have to stay until the 9 p.m., 10 p.m. bulletin with this person? Why do I have to go to his office? Because in most instances, it's the boss. Those feelings will not be there when you're dating, when you're courting, right?
It's interesting that you talk about Amwick, you talk about AWIM, you talk about women in news. So these are all amazing organizations that are, they're working to create enabling environment for African women in the media in their own various ways. So how important, and obviously you are now the vice president of Amwake, right? So the Association of Media Women in Kenya. So how important have you found all of these associations and what they're doing, what we're trying to achieve? How have you found it for your career development?
That's a big one. That's a big one again because when I first joined, when first became an employee with my first job, I did not know that such organizations existed. So I was in my cocoon alone thinking, how do I navigate? Um, who do I go to when I feel like I'm not okay? Who do I go to when I feel like I'm ready to go to the next level? I, I want to do what she's doing. I want to speak up there, you know. I want to be up on the podium. A lot of questions in your mind, but no one to ask, you know, no one to guide you when you take a path you think is the path to take you to where you want to go, but it's not the right path. Um, so again, when I was at Citizen and I couldn't find someone to hear me, um, I reached out to a friend who was part of Amway and who I had seen doing all these things that I have talked about. She was speaking on podiums. She would speak to the boss like he's a normal person because as women growing up, I feel like we are taught to treat our bosses as if they are gods, no offense. Um, so seeing her just comfortable in her being, comfortable in her skin, and basically the world was her oyster, and I wanted that for myself because for me, Amwik was a safe space. So when I joined, I was a passive member, just sitting in the background, not talking, looking at these women and wondering, oh wow. But because now I joined the sisterhood, it started rubbing off on me. We'd have meetings where we'd be told, speak up. Doesn't matter if you feel like um, it's not the right thing or you're not, you know, vocalizing it correctly. But anytime we have a meeting, speak up. And when we have that meeting, remember when you go back to your workplace, when you go back to your home, speak up. Don't leave anywhere without speaking up. If it's in a pitching, if people are pitching stories, pitch it. If it's not taken, try again tomorrow. If you're not comfortable with how the newsroom, you know, how people treat each other, how the boss treats you, speak up. Just say something, you know. Don't let yourself be a piece of furniture in a place that you spend a lot of the hours of your life in. So because I surrounded myself with women who were where I wanted to be, I became those women.
And that is so powerful because they say, don't you, that if you wanna elevate yourself, you need to be around people that are elevated, that are above wherever you are now, and it doesn't help you to kind of be with other people who make you feel good because they're the best in the room.
Exactly, exactly. And oftentimes we also play small because I've been with amazing women, from news anchors to public speakers to whatever the role, and they play small, especially when in the presence of a man, because again, culture, lots to unpack there. So even today, when we are in, let's say, for example, a conference and women introduce themselves, you will see women playing small. And those are the things that we are told on a regular basis at Amwick, at Arwin, at Women in News. Shout about your achievements. How will people know, right, what you're doing, the amazing work that you're doing? Um, because not that we are not comfortable in our skin as women, not that we want to be men, but men do it without thinking twice. Um, they will say, I was president of, you know, I did this story in Kenya and it won, you know, an award. So just amplifying the work that you do, being proud of the work that you do. So it is here that I learned how to do those things. Um, Speaking up and again training. We now train a lot of um, media houses on not just sexual harassment, but um, how to differentiate themselves, how to be different, you know, um, because we lack things like mentorship in newsrooms. We don't have systems, you know, it's not prioritized. And you'll find probably newsroom managers or owners saying, there's no time, you know, we need the story, we need the story. So there's no mentorship, there's no guidance, there's no, and then also again, the media in Kenya is often criticized nowadays that they have become very shallow. They focused on clickbait. Um, the stories are not in depth, and most of all, stories that have to do with gender don't make it to mainstream media. So if you're looking for a story or people's experiences on sexual harassments, you'll have to find the Awin podcast. You'll never find it on mainstream media. And that is number one among our priorities, to change the way the media portrays issues, because any issue that you speak about has the gender aspect, whether you like it or not. And that has to be featured into your story.
Earlier on you'd talked about solutions that we're very kind of used to saying here's the problem, and it's great, that's part of the process. So before we can even get to the point of solutions, right, we need to know the issues, we need to know the vocabulary to speak about the issues, right? So looking forward, Rachel, thinking about all of these, the journey that you've had and how you've used it to become a strong vocal advocate to challenge the status quo, to work towards creating a different environment for the next generation of journalists. Thinking about think and particularly around sexual harassment and also mentorship, because you spoke twice there about mentorship. If there was one thing or even a couple of things that you feel really needs to change, that people still play lip service to, what would that be? And how do you want the people listening to this podcast, what actions would you like them to take to put that into a reality?
The first one is from a managerial point of view. We seem to strongly believe that having women in leadership is the solution to these problems that we're talking about. It is not, because if if you've listened to what I spoke about when I joined this other media firm, I talked about my boss, the one who would always tell me, Rachel, why don't you go and speak here? Why don't you take up this training opportunity? He is a man. He is a man. And I don't think that he went through training that where he learned how to propel women and not see them as competition. I don't know what his journey has been, so I cannot speak to that. But we need to do away with the idea that women are the solutions to their problems. And this is another reason why, anytime we speak about rape, sexual harassment, all these things, it becomes a fight against men and women. And yet you find that most of the times, as much as it's women who are more affected, percentage wise, the numbers, men still go through. Like if a man goes through sexual harassment in the newsroom, the feelings, the violations are still the same, right? So if we just focus on putting, because I have seen in my own experience that when you propel a woman to a management position and she is not aware, we are talking about training, we are talking about, you know, vocabulary, we are talking about interventions. If you put a woman there thinking she's going to speak about the ills, she's going to do something about it, you're bound to fail, because this woman has not been brought up in a bubble. She's been brought up in a society where patriarchy thrives. So you are at risk of continually perpetuating the ills, because she will be fighting against a system. And as human beings, it is so much easier most of the time to just go with the flow. You know, I now have this leadership position as Rachel, and because I want to maintain what it does for me, I want to maintain my pay, I want to be able to provide for my family, I want not to anger or make the owners of this organization uncomfortable, I am going to still either stay silent or I am going to be a perpetrator. So we have to be intentional about the people we put up in leadership, irrespective of the gender.
Because also those positions, number one, has got to come with the equity, to be able to actually make those impacts. But then also there's this perspective that, well, we've put you there now, you're a woman, we've put you there in this position of leadership, do it, show us you can do it. And then when they don't do the smallest
Yeah, these women,
things, like, you see, we tried and she didn't do it.
we are judged so much harsher than men are, and it is what it is, the catchphrase people like saying. But as long as we are not intentional about the integrity of the people we put in leadership, it won't matter what you want to change. The status quo will remain the same. So that's in terms of the media management perspective. But in terms of um, the other positions, me who works in an organization, if we continue to stay silent about things that we feel are not right, either when they happen to us or to someone else, nothing's going to ever change. So, as you said, rightly said, there is a place for lamentations. And lamentations may seem like an unfair word, but we have to speak out for people to know that this is happening to my friend, this is happening to my colleague. But in terms of interventions, we also have to know where to find that help, right? So I feel there's a need for organizations such as Amwick, AWIM, and all the ones leading, interventions in this space to amplify the work that they do. I feel like a lot of times we have conversations in silos, either in a fancy hotel, either in, on YouTube. Um, and I know we cannot reach every person everywhere, but probably we can do this by maybe collaborating, you know what I mean? Or increasing the pressure. I don't know whether you saw an incident in Kenya where three hosts of a radio show were fired because they were making fun of a gender based violence victim who was thrown from a certain floor to the ground and she got injured. And her story made it to social media and again to mainstream media. But as we were saying before, it was her fault. The host was saying it was her fault. Why did she take herself to this man? So the reason they ended up getting fired is because advertisers said they're going to pull out of that media house. And there was a chance there for organizations to take that up and say, hey, we can work with those people because now this incident is now in history. We are not talking about it anymore. And yet, that pressure that I'm talking about comes from such people, because media houses are not listening to us. They're pushing back, right? The system pushes back. So we have to push back as well, and we can use different ways of doing that, but take advantage when something like that happens. Take advantage form partnerships of like-minded individuals. Some of the organizations that said they would pull out were headed by women, and that was an intentional woman, right? She said, we are going to pull out. And it could have, again, been a man, but it would have been an intentional man. So we need to think, yeah, we need to think outside the box when it comes to interventions, and not just always do the nice, polite, call people to a meet. Because if we do that, we are going to be talking about these issues for the next 10, 20, 30 years, right? So we really have to think outside the box and be bad girls. I'm still going to insist. Let's be bad girls.
Let's be bad girls.
Yes.
So what's next for you, Rachel Ombaka, on this journey? What are we expecting from you next?
A lot. I'm not sure I'm even ready for it myself. Um, Tomorrow I leave for a training. I'm going to be training journalists in those who cover stories from refugee camps in northern Kenya. So I'm going to be training them on how to cover, we were talking about this earlier, how to cover stories from a gendered lens, from a human rights lens. Um, and I'll be partnering with UN Women. So